Hello again, I'm Greg. This time I'm going to embed a link in the description because we actually have some images to look at and share together throughout the narrative, and you'll be able to follow that narrative word for word. Obviously, I'm going to comment on it as well, and then actually see the images that we're going to be discussing today. This is the image as testamentary. What does it mean to have something in front of you which could be considered a testament to something else or something other than it is? Even if we have a portrait, and we'll look at a number of portrait paintings, but also portrait photography, the testament is ostensibly to the person, but there's something more going on as well. Because remember, we're moving in hermeneutics away from authorship to a more generalized sense of authority. Okay, and we've talked about that at length already. In fact, one of the great themes of this new series is learning how to question that concept, the concept itself, authority, and not just sources of authority or figures of authority or representations of authority, but the concept itself. So let's continue. The historicity, this is Dilthey's term, of any image orbits then not authorship, but rather authority. Authorship is associated, as well as authorial intent, with the romantic hermeneutics of Friedrich Schleiermacher. Authority, though, and history later on in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, if you will. This, as stated, is not only an outcome of the further generalization of the actual objective scope of hermeneutics, but as well its own extension of breadth at another level, that of purpose. Okay. The apical model of intent questions the meaning of text or textuality from the point of view that the truest meaning can only be had from its creator. What did the oracle mean? What does Scripture intend? What means the prose of the word into world? All of these questions are ancient, if not primordial. But Dilthey makes equal the one who is interpreting textuality and now world text analogs as well. Okay, so this is where the reader starts to kind of gain their own authority, that we bring our own experience to reading this image or reading this text. This is yet another crucial move on his part and for the history of modern hermeneutics as a whole. Before this, the truth seeker was engaged in a pilgrimage. Yes, it meant something to them to be the one who does seek, but the truth lies all on the side of what is sought and not who is seeking it. Okay, very important point. Dilthey evens the dynamic by reminding us that we live within contemporary truths, and thus anything we get out of a text must be lensed through this living context. This sounds very pat today, of course, but we have to recall to ourselves the cultural imagination that believed in the concept of the transcendental in general. Its archetype became, with the first agrarian civilizations, a most unearthly one, so to speak. Even so, the other world served in the interim as not only a goal, hence the drive even into the 19th century to engage in a pilgrimage to seek truth, but as a template. Through gaining the truth of the intended authorial meaning, especially that of God, one then participated in both an exemplar and a rehearsal for transcendence, and that of both world and one's particular time period. Dilthey is more cautious, and on multiple fronts. He does not allow for such a clear-cut overcoming of one's own historicality. The Aufheben, the apex of the dialectic, here is rather historicity, which comes about by placing oneself in the middle distance between past and present, which partakes more or less by definition of both. This encounter takes place in a living present, but it is, by his own terms, partially dislocated from it through the act of interpreting something which had its own day in some other period than our own. We bring this textuality into the present, and thus it regains some of its own presence in so being. We shall see when we talk about world in part 4 later on that our encounters with others accomplishes a similar phenomenological maneuver. Okay? We're talking right now about images only, in a sense. We're concentrating on that, but then when we come to talking about the social world and, of course, the life world, then it is the presence of another human being, that kind of forces this once epistemological issue for Dilthey. But Dilthey is on the way to this, thus far furthest reckoning of our ability to understand meaningful intent in the world. This is why imagery is so suited for an explication of historical or historicizing hermeneutics. It presents both a quasi-text to be read as one would read the proverbial 1,000 words, but it also presents, especially in Dilthey's own day, an other to self which is a quasi-person, okay? Or at the very least a space, within which oneself could wander. Okay? So we're talking at first about a portrait, a quasi-person, and then a landscape, as we'll see. Okay? The bias here in imagery, especially at the time, was clearly the oil painting, and within that, the major genres of subject matter: portraits, landscapes, which would include the still life variety, and historical scenes. These three major types of image call to us in their respective and different ways. In doing so, they bring out the key relevant processes for interpretation to be successful. Let's take a look at each of them in turn now. Think about portraits, especially during a time when the portrait painter was being elbowed aside, especially by the lesser social classes, because the shocking and astonishing invention of the camera appears from about 1837 onwards. Several independent inventors, Fox Talbot, Daguerre in France, and so on. So we've got from this period, 1837 or so, same year that Victoria ascends to the throne, we have in some ways a new period, which we know now as the Victorian period. Much of the 19th century and slightly into the 20th century. And at the same time, we have this very new and very realistic, hyper-realistic almost, imager at hand. Okay. But whether it is a photo or a painting or whatever, the portrait demands interaction. We must engage with the image as we would a person, even if silently. The painted one examines we as well, and in so doing prompts a self-examination. The eyes, of course, proverbially, a great portrait always has these eyes that uncannily follow us around the room. There's always kind of a bit of a astonishing moment to realize that we are being gazed at, if you will. The eyes not only follow us in their patently uncanny manner, but they import their own agenda. This alone tells me as a viewer that there is more than one intent at stake. Figuring out what the intent of the work in question is about now means not to know the actual figure in the figure in the painting. In fact, we may have very little information about their actual biography, but instead to know why another, as well as an other, is so keenly interested that we engage with them. When I stare at a portrait, I am stared at by it. But this return gaze is not a reflection, for a portrait is not at first a mere mirror. It becomes more of a mirror to my conscience than to my own appearance. The portrait questions my presence in the present, and that in a double sense. How is it that this latter day, the very future for whomever was once sitting in front of the painter, has any interest in that very person? If we could actually speak with the one who has been immortalized upon canvas, they would clearly be astonished, not only at the world and its future, but more importantly, that futurity itself celebrates, in some august and even overstudied manner, that which was, for the time, simply an exercise in familial posterity, and perhaps even less than that, biographical retrospect of the kind any cell phone camera user expects today. So, their gaze captured by the skill, or yet the genius of the artist, is not prescient of anything but its own present into future. We may then think of portraits as kindred with portrait photography, certainly readily available in Dilthey's own time. Photography at first suffered from the sense that its only use was an inexpensive alternative to hiring a real artist. Its genres were those of painting, and its advent caused similar concern that we today manifest in the face of AI overtaking human creators. But a human being still took the photo, and gradually photography did itself become its own art form, no longer obeying the frame of the painter and as well attempting its own subject matter. The image we have of AI is somewhat different, as there is a sense that it will eventually be able to program and thus control its own doings. Even so, this is the very thing that Dilthey exhorted us to do as interpretants. Bring what is of your own day into the past, and thus create a connection between yourself and the textuality in question. It is almost as if we must conjure a manner to attract the attention of what is past, or perhaps of history itself. The past cannot walk forward alone in order to meet us halfway in this version of hermeneutics, without us having something to offer it in return. Like sharing a life problem, one which many or most of us face if we live long enough, the present shares conditions with the past. The past thus can recognize itself in the present if we allow it to do so. We do not merely wave or gesture at it, but exemplify before it our own bared souls, especially so in the case of portraiture, which for us today can include the early portrait photography, and often most poignantly. Okay, the example off the Carolina coast witnessed the recent discovery of a hoard of photographs from the early 1860s recovered from the very sunken wreck, which took many of these same persons' lives. For it is our conscience which is first being questioned, and such interrogation inevitably leads to a discussion of the character of one's soul or psyche. Rembrandt is, of course, for many commentators' favorite genius when it comes to portraits. There is an aura about these works which pervades into the very space of the interlocutor. I have myself been in front of several Rembrandts, and not only do the figures in them stare right into you, they bear their souls to you, and in so doing, you're compelled to enter a pretty radical self-examination, whether it might be something very powerful and positive like love, Rembrandt's paintings of his wife and especially his second wife, whether it is betrayal, whether it is some kind of pathos or tragedy. These paintings affect us. It's almost as if there's something alive and present with you in the room. Okay? So this kind of aura is able to perform such an uncanny feat because what traverses time are the elemental emotions of our shared humanity: grief, betrayal, remorse, love, desire, and other such archetypical states of being. The power of an image is based very much upon how it affects us, we the living. It tells us more than they were like us back then. It speaks to the human condition and allows us to ask not only what it is, but why it is so. Okay, so we've got a couple of portraits following this in the thread that you'll be able to follow of a couple of young women who were drowned in this wreck, and their very portraits survive. So there's some poignant and even uncanny things going on there. These are images recovered from the wreck of the SS Central America, 1862. Here is a Rembrandt painting, okay, of his spouse following that. If portrait imagery seeks a kind of union with the living representative of potential further in-genre examples, the portrait has revealed itself to be a soul mirror, and in so doing casts aside the sham of surface, right? A surface question would be, what on earth do I have in common with Gainsborough's glamorous tragic actress, Mrs. Sarah Siddons, for instance? Almost nothing. But that's not the point. Then the landscape, if we turn to landscape, invites us to bodily enter into itself. There is no breach of ethics here. Even if I desire the living version of Sarah Siddons, though with different hair and vestments, she is herself safe from my base advances. The portrait maintains its integrity by calling into question our own. The landscape, by contrast, demands action by proffering imagination. The scene is set, and all we need to do is appear on its stage. Instead of the interlocutor of psyche, this actor begins the interpretive process by allowing himself to be taken away, as it were, into another realm. Landscape more fully exemplifies the fantastic, even the phantasmagorical, for though there may be figures wandering about within it, these are not and never portraits of actual people, studied and taken apart to be reassembled through the painter's own sense of what is of the essence. Compare the lurid, unforgiving, and indeed unrelenting portraits by Otto Dies to those of either Rembrandt or Gainsborough. Dies could be seen as the dialectical apex here. He takes the essential emotions of the first and expresses how these human charagmata are corrupted and debased by the social presentations of the second. Otto Dies, by the way, is actually my personal favorite oil painter. The landscape turns away from all of this interiority and offers to us rather the external vision. Its world has its own soul, and one can still learn something of the intent of such a world if one has the necessary sense of adventure. Okay, so there's Mrs. Siddons as we scroll down. By Gainsborough, 1793. Here is a portrait of just a young woman by Otto Dies from 1921. You can see the emotions and more there. There is yet a testamentary quality to both landscape and portrait, as well as to our third major example, the historical scene or vignette. The landscape requires us to consider how we move about in our world and the meaning of our actions within it. What is our wider purpose? How do we gain the world or regain it? Or, if this be not our own destiny, how have we been shaped by said world, and why so? The painter has also given us a number of clues about how their world was perceived in its own time, which helps us examine how we ourselves see the present world. Landscape is, in a sense, its own wider portraiture. It owes nothing to persons, and its subject matter has allowed the artist a much wider freedom of interpretation, which, in our own such work, we must also attempt to take into account. The mash-ups of portrait and landscape, a favorite of the Mannerists, are always portraits first, the landowner on his land, for instance. John Berger, the famous art historian, takes a very Marxian line with them, but less obvious is his analysis of pseudo-portraits, landscapes which feature either allegorical figures or simply those stock. The pornography of the day, with its luscious and ever-inviting embrace, hung upon the most respectable of walls and galleries, perhaps unlike our own variety, which rather lurks instead of exhibits, and Berger notes provided a reminder to the presumed male viewer that no matter his own respective position in society, he still lorded over women. What is left to the side of this refracted harem is the sense that women themselves could use such imagery as a reminder to men that they held both the key to desire but also to good conscience. The woman of the day was the moral compass of the social compact, even if men needed to be directed to this compass through less noble means. So here's a typical portrait of the period, and then a typical piece of kind of what we would call softcore pornography or illustration. And once again, these are in the thread. The landscape of any familially oriented social unit is today not dissimilar, which not only vexes feminists of all stripes, but as well appears at best quaint and at worst misogynist. Once again, and in contrast to the portrait masquerading as landscape, these landscapes speak to a social portraiture. They express types of persons and not the individuated case study like a portrait would. Thus, the so-called beautiful girl trope, so dear from the Renaissance onwards and bodily into our own text-to-image AI-generated imagery today, is never anyone in particular. For a woman, such a vast archives is useful, not for self-definition, but for means ends. For men make nothing secret of their desires, and even if a woman has no need of a man, she still has a need of men's self-perceptions. So, this genre of landscape allows for much insight into the world, which it seemingly so summarily portrays. The oft agreed upon first hyper-realist landscapes, those of Canaletto and his circle situated in Venice, still often recorded highlights of the annual social circle and social cycle, which at once served as a postcard effect. It's basically, it was saying, well, come to Venice during the gondola races or whatever, and as emblematic of the specific place and its history and culture. Hobbema is more austere, even verging upon the surreal, with his landscapes surely the forerunners of those of Hypnosis, the graphic design company responsible for many of popular music's most iconic album covers. Constable, by contrast, is at once nostalgic and compassionate. If I entered a Canaletto, I must be prepared for a carnival. If a Hobbema, I may encounter one of Rod Serling's ancestors. And if a John Constable, I might well meet that aforementioned beautiful girl, only to find that she is already wedded to the land itself. So here we have some famous looks of the Doge's Palace in Venice, the Haywain, and the Hobbema that people usually look at. And then below I've just inserted one of the illustrations of Hypnosis, this one from Pink Floyd's 1975 album, Wish You Were Here. In all such cases, however, the registered scene is more than it seems to be. A landscape is both a portrait of a world rather than a person, and is as well a record of our own world, as it was then, and also how it was. This is where Dilthey seeks entrance. We travel to this other country by way of the fact that its otherness is not spatial but temporal, just as is the otherness of a portrait not personal but cultural. I recognize the buildings in Venice. Indeed, many of them still yet stand, and though no specific tree of Hobbema or Constable, or for that matter, Emily Carr, remains as they themselves encountered them, I still know a tree when I see one. Even the backmat landscapes hand-painted of the original Star Trek series contain almost all recognizable elements, and what is alien about them is the same as what is purportedly alien about the story itself. In a word, not so much. The textuality of image seeks to communicate with us, just as much as it does text proper. It is hardly ever deliberately obscure, for then it would not be art. as it would have abandoned the chief reason for its very existence. So here we've just got an example of a backmat from the original series of Star Trek, so 1966 to 1969. Finally, the historical scene. If we turn to our third major sort of genre of imagery, especially in Dilthey's time and before, long before, the historical scene or vignette calls upon us not to be either an interlocutor or an adventurer. Okay? The portrait demands our interlocution, the landscape demands our sense of adventure, but here we're being called upon rather simply to be a witness. Something of note took place, from the painter's viewpoint close, and perhaps as well close at hand, to his here and now. Like a history book, the vignette records as well as interprets something of the wider human history, though selected from among many possible candidates, thereby engaging in a more exclusive project than a textual compendium of a specific time period, for instance. Okay, so the vignette is not a history textbook by any means. This kind of image is most transparent, not in its meaning per se, but in that it has meaning, and thus should provoke in us, as children of our own historical period, a sense of useful and perhaps even profound meaningfulness. The portrait declaims meaning too specific to the image, and the landscape opens up the question of meaning by eschewing any, at least at first. But the vignette directs us immediately to the meaning of the event in its own time, or, since antiquity was a favorite topic from the Renaissance up until post-Romanticism, how history is itself viewed over the course of a more recent history. Now that's also a very interesting angle, right? We get to see how our nearer ancestors viewed our farther ancestors, if you will. Okay? This is a most valuable item for us, as it enables a more canny perspective upon how we ourselves perceive history, which aspects thereof are more valued and why, and as well the obverse, okay, which aspects are shunned or even taboo, and again, why so? We gain purchase upon our own bigotries by being able to discern the blinders put up in prior epochs. Why were they so interested in them, for instance, where the first might be the painters of the French Revolution and the second topics from Greece and Rome, to offer a basic example. Allegories can be placed at a distance or made very present by offering in-period events as figurative or even archetypical. Witness the death of Marat, famous painting by David, which is at once a paean to a lost friend, but also the same to a lost ideal. Okay, so there's the meta-text, the meta-narrative, if you will, right? This fellow was the artist's friend, so there's a tragedy there at the personal level, but because he is being portrayed as an archetypical figure, almost a mythic figure, we can say the same, that the metatext has this lost ideal. Similarly, Goya's excruciating scenes of the Napoleonic War in Spain are comments not only upon the character of warfare and its anything-goes mentality, something we are equally familiar with in our own day, but as well a remark on the human character itself. Yet neither artist would ever think to suggest that humanity is only this, right, or what it has yet wrought. And this is another insight such vignettes propose, that to be human is to be capable of inhumanity and the reactionary, but that both of these indeed occur, because we also have the kindle of futurity in our collective humaneness. Okay, so here is David's Death of Marat in his bath, famous painting, and then a sketch, sort of watercolor sketch from Goya, the horrors of war, if you will, the disasters of war. Sometimes it's translated as a series of these sketches. Okay? And again, in thread, you'll see all of these images. But all that said, the historical vignette suffers similar weakness, as does the landscape and the portrait, in that it may be an agenda item for the politics of the day, or a kind of celebration of a provincial attitude. Goya would have been entranced, but if also sagely shocked by the photographs taken within the midst of the American Civil War in the immediate aftermath of battle. Not only would he have recognized his own work, but also more widely his own kind at work. That few in the United States knew the effect of mass warfare, Napoleon's own adventures had brought the very thing into being. It is not astonishing, though still of interest, that many field carronades used in the Civil War were in fact called Napoleons, only enhanced the reputation of these photos, the first from-life images of warfare. Both sides sought a record, not only to document their mutual bad conscience, but also to perhaps leave a legacy of caution for today's union, seemingly as fragile as the one the blue and the gray knew then. So here we have some fantastic photos of the American Civil War. This is Vicksburg, the Siege of Vicksburg. And I myself have been on those very siege foundations and parapets and walked them, and the steepness of them is astonishing. And then Confederate dead from another battle. And once again, in thread, these images. The vignette is not always of great historical import. When the topic of the image is humanity, but not persons or personality, this human landscape takes on a simpler testament. It records simply life as it is, in the social world as it is. So Honor Daumier, another famous painting, The Third Class Carriage, or even Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, both very well-known oil paintings, are documentations of this sort. We've got them both reproduced here in thread. Note that unlike both allegorical scenes, as well as those of known, even if recent historical import, this further subspecies of vignette calls attention away from its subject matter by using the pretense of a mundane and altogether bland title. We are not to focus on either the carriage or the lunch. The artist has, almost blithely, tossed off the scene as a frame to itself to be discarded. The purpose here is to underscore the banality of what is actually of interest. Yes, this is a most commonplace thing I've rendered, but look at all of the nuanced humanity within. We can hear the voices of the subjects, though none of them have sat for portraits. The fatalistic sighs of the passengers, who at least could afford to take the train rather than riding in a wagon or yet walking to market. Their downcast faces tell of a kind of numbness to desperation, rather than that of the immediately desperate itself, as is so often the action of the allegory. The passenger and the luncheon taker seem to be worlds apart, and certainly from a class perspective they inhabit differing and even confrontational social worlds. But nevertheless, they more widely and deeply dwell in the same existential world. The luncheoners exhibit their own blitheness, to the point of shedding the veils of Victorian prudishness. The world is deep, as Nietzsche intoned, but in the face of such depth, sometimes all one can do is go to market or get naked, whatever might come first. So we've reproduced those two paintings there. Concluding, both the most uncommon and the most common are the major species of the vignette. These three forms of imagery, which require of us each their respective hermeneutic stances. The portrait demands dialogue and self-reflection, the landscape an ability to get out of oneself and examine the world, and the vignette the social version of the worldly examination, and in this it occupies the apical space in the dialectic of objective image. These hermeneutic stances extend both the notion of what can be read as well as how one engages in reading itself, in that the interpretation of image best represents Dilthey's own extension of the methods and scope of hermeneutics. Okay. In order to pursue the progress and process of basic hermeneutics, we're going to turn now in the next episode to part 3, as well as in so doing, we're going to introduce our next key figure in that history, the philosopher Martin Heidegger. And our next key object, we're going to be turning from image this time to music. Music presents to the interpreter yet another challenge, even further removed from the written logos and its visual homologue, and yet somehow, to our own minds and perhaps also to our souls, approaches yet closer to the divinity of utter clarity and truth. Till next time, thank you again.